Everyone, what's up? And welcome back to another episode with some Pot Limit Omaha content. Today we're going to review 3 hands submitted on our new forum within the PLO Mastermind. These hands have been submitted by one of the members of the PLO Mastermind. All questions talk about being the pre-flop aggressor. One is about a 4-bet pot, one is about a 3-bet pot, and one is about the single raise pot. The specific questions will rise up when we are in each hand. I got the hands imported into PokerJuice to make them more visual for you. We're going to review them and look into whether or not we made the correct play or whether or not Hero made the correct play. As you can see, this is the forum. This is the first hand that has been submitted. We're going to learn more about it. We're going to review the hand and we'll go from there. So as mentioned, 3 hands for all of you. And here we go. The first one is sitting in early position here. We open raise ace, ace, jack, 7, single suited. We get a 3-bet by the button. We're playing PLO 25 cent, 50 cent, by the way. We're 4-betting here pretty standard at 100 big blind. The button calls and the flop is 4, 6, 5 rainbow. The hero decides to get the money in here and the button folds. Now in the forum, he's basically asking like, is this the right play or not? And is this a board we are betting or not? How often are we supposed to bet here? And is this a hand we should just stack off or not? Is this board dry enough or not, basically? So that is what we're going to learn more about. I got a sim lined up for you all here. This is the same situation. It's a 4-bet pot. The board is 6-5-4 rainbow. As you can see it here, we are the blue player being out of position, holding all the aces in our 4-betting range. And as you can see on 6-5-4 rainbow, early position versus button, we can see that we basically can get away with betting our entire range. We're mainly shoving. 82% of the time we are shoving. There is a fraction, around 18% of the time, that we're betting small, because a couple of our hands are either extremely strong or they totally miss the board and therefore they want to bet fold the flop. So if you would select the small bet and our opponent would go in, there is like a 13% bet fold on the flop basically. But you can see that we're mainly just going to shove here. As mentioned, ace, ace, jack, 7 as well. This hand is also a clear shove. The SPR is low, the board is dry enough, and we're just supposed to get the money in here. So that is good, the play our hero made. But I got another question here, and that is like, what happens if the board changes? So what I did is I opened up the same situation with a different flop texture, basically. And we're going to see something interesting. Like if we're playing the same situation, early position versus button, 4-bet pot, and we change the board from 6-5-4 rainbow to 9-8-7 rainbow, you can see something drastically changing. And that is that we're now supposed to check our entire range. And that is because this board texture interacts much, much better with our opponent than a 6-5-4 rainbow. In addition to that, this board is also much worse for our range than the other board texture. So ranges completely shift here. And if you look into the equity graph, which shows how both ranges interact to this flop texture, you can see that the red line, which is the opponent in the button position at this situation, holds a massive advantage. He has a lot more equity, 73%. He has a lot more connection to the board. Like he has just all the straights, all the 2 pairs, all the sets. Like he's just doing extremely well here. While our range, yes, we do have a couple of strong hands here, but we're mainly holding all the bare aces here throughout the board here. You can see the blue line here sitting at around 20% of equity on average here with a lot of these hands. And therefore we are supposed to do a lot of checking here. And this board is a great example where we are simplifying checking our entire range just because our range is doing so poorly against our opponent's 3-bet and calling range. Now a side note here, obviously, if your opponent is 3-betting and not folding enough versus 4-bets, then ranges will shift a little bit again and you will get a little bit more equal to your opponent, but you're still in a tough position and this board is still much better for your opponent. So still checking the majority of your range or even full range there would be totally fine. So that is a takeaway for this situation. And I see like many players, especially at low stakes, just stacking off way too often here, just potting all their aces. And you can see now here that this is just a massive mistake. Okay, that was the first hand. Keep that in mind, guys. Here we saw the board. Our hero basically did play the hand correctly. And we're gonna move on to the second hand here, which is this one. I'm gonna open it up in PokerJuice here. The board is Jack 4, 5, 5 ace basically. We're gonna play through the hand and then we're gonna learn more about the situation. So hero is sitting in the big blind. The button does go for the raise. We're playing Pilo 100 this time. We 3-bet pretty standardly. We are sitting at around 150 big blinds effectively. The flop is Jack 4 or 5 rainbow. And the first question I want to ask you, like, is this a board you're going to do a lot of betting on, a lot of checking on? Is it like a medium board when it comes to frequencies? Hero does decide to go for the check on the flop, facing like a little bit over half pot, but stabbed by the imposition player. He does go for the check call. The turn is a 5, and now Hero decides to lead, thinking that the 5 is pretty good for his range and therefore getting value from, for example, kings or Jack X or some flush draws. So he does lead and get called. The river is great, of course. Hero decides to bet small on the river. He gets called, and the hand shows up Jack, Jack 7, 6. So he was massively behind on the flop and the turn. And the question, of course, is like, is the play on the flop correct? And also, is the turn lead correct on this specific situation? So we're going to learn more about that as well, because those were the questions asked in the forum. I'm going to open it up here. I do have a board that is extremely similar, so we're going with that one. Here you can see it. It is loading it up. The board in this question that I took was Jack 4, 3 rainbow, but I think it's totally fine in comparison to Jack 5, 4 rainbow. We have a massive flop database within the PLO mastermind with all these sims in there basically, and we're trying to pick as often as possible sims from there so we don't have to rerun every specific situation. Okay, so this is the board, and as you can see, we are supposed to do a checking. We are supposed to have a checking frequency of around 56%. We're mixing it up, betting 2/3 pot and full pot of around 20 to 23% of the time. If you look at the equity graph here, so how both ranges interact to the board, you can see that we do have an advantage in terms of equity, but also when it comes to the range versus range interaction here, we have a little bit more strong made hands, or at least better hands in comparison to our opponent. And that advantage mainly comes from the fact that we have stronger one-pair holdings versus our opponent's one-pair holdings. If you look into a hand like ace, ace, queen, queen, you can see that we're checking 62% of the time, we're betting 37 or so. With 2 backdoor flush draws, this is definitely going to be a bet. With 1 backdoor flush draw, there's some betting, there's also some checking. So we can go either way, betting or checking. Without a backdoor flush draw, as you can see, it's a clear check. The main patterns when you think about your betting strategy here is how well connected are you to the low section of the board? Like, do you have straight draws? Do you have backdoor flush draws? Do you have blockers to your opponent's continuing range? Do you have like a jack? Do you have something that you can be capable of barreling turns and rivers with a reasonable frequency? And if you don't have that, then very often you will end up checking because you don't really benefit from inflating the size of the pot too much, and you have less fold equity because you don't have any substantial blockers. So our hand was supposed to be a mix, sort of. Hero does decide to go for the check. If he faces a stab on the flop, a hand like ace, ace, queen, queen here is a clear check call. So far, so good. Let's move on to the turn, where we do have a separate simulation for. Opening it up here. The turn was the 4, which is basically the same here as that you can see the turn was a 5. So it's a representative situation again. And one thing that stands out right away is that the out of position player, which is the hero basically, is going to check almost his entire range 99% of the time. And the reason is because this card isn't necessarily too great for his range. As you look into the equity graph here, you can see that the in-position player, which is the red line, has a massive advantage when it comes to polarity here. He has a lot more strong made hands. After betting the flop and getting check called, the in-position player has a stronger range here, and the out-of-position player, which is the blue line, is sort of in this either bluff-catching scenario, or he wants to sort of manage the pot by keeping it somewhat small here with all these hands. Okay, so the in-position player is going to do quite a bit of stabbing with the strong hands here. And because the ranges interact the way they are, so we are in a massive disadvantage when it comes to polarity, we are going to mainly check our entire range, because if we start betting some of our strong hands and some of our medium strong hands, our checking range becomes extremely unprotected and unbalanced, and our opponent can get away with betting a lot of hands there and just making us check fold. In addition to that, also, if you think about the ranges in play, like the buttons range will definitely connect reasonably well. For example, with a 4 here, you can have a lot of 4x betting on the flop and now turning trips, for example. He can have jacks, he can have boats here. A button range definitely connects well to this board. If you play, for example, against a much tighter range, leading in certain sense when the bottom card or the middle card pairs could make sense, but not in this specific situation. So hero did go for the lead, but a hand like ace, ace, queen, queen here, as you say, is just going to be check. If we go back to the actual hand here, which is here, and we move to the turn, we are supposed to do a check here. If we then check and our opponent does go for the bet, a hand like ace, ace, queen, queen is generally still going to check call in this situation. Okay, so a slight mistake here on the turn, not thinking deeply enough about the range interaction, not realizing that the 5 is actually better for the in-position player than for the out-of-position player. So we bet small, get called, the river is an ace. I think betting now is totally fine. You want to get value from like 5x, maybe from a lot of hands, like many hands will just simply check back if you decide to check here. So I think betting is fine. Sizing, I'm not entirely sure. I'll probably go a little bit larger here because the ace is so strong for your range, basically. Okay, that being said, interesting hand. Think about those takeaways, especially for the turn when it comes to leading versus checking after check calling the flop. And we're going to move on to the last and final hand, which is a single raise pot here. I am opening it up here, or at least you can see it in the forum here. But before we're going to look into that, I'm going to load it up into PokerJuice again. And let's go to the flop here. The pre-flop first, ace, king, 10, 9, opening early position. Again, we're playing PLO 100. The button does go for the call. The players fold. The flop is 10, 6, 4, two-toned. And at this point, our hero decides to bet the flop. And his question is like, is betting actually the correct play with this hand? Should we go for a check call, check raise, check fold? Like, what should we think about here, really? And there are a few interesting takeaways for this situation that I also see many players do make a lot of mistakes about. So let's open up the sim here. I got a very similar board again, Jack 7-5 in comparison to, or 10-7-5 in comparison to 10-6-4 would be totally fine. And the first takeaway here, as you can see, is that the out of position player is not going to do too much betting here. He's only betting 15% of his range. And there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, whenever you open raise and an in-position player decides to cold call, the cold calling range in general is pretty strong, tight, and well-defined. And that is because he has more players behind him. He's not closing the action, for example, as in the big blind. And therefore, he has to be selective with the hands that he's cold calling with. He's also playing against a tight range opening, so he wants to be selective with the hands that he's cold calling with. So because his range is stronger, like range versus range interaction becomes more equal. And whenever that is the case and you're out of position, you have to be selective because you're in an informational disadvantage, basically. You are the one having to act first on every street. And because the board here, for example, is very dynamic, textures will shift a lot going from flop to turn to river. So the nuts is going to change a lot. And that is obviously very disadvantageous for the out of position player. The second disadvantage of being out of position in comparison to being in position is because that whenever you're out of position, you won't automatically realize your equity when you check. As your opponents can now bet and force some of your hands to fold whenever you go for the check, this forces you to check a very balanced range in order for your opponent not being able to step very aggressively and extremely wide. So whenever you check some of your medium strong hands or weak hands, and your opponent now takes a step, you have to fold some of those hands and you cannot realize your equity anymore, which is different than when you're in position, of course, because whenever you have a hand there, you can just check back and realize your equity that way because your opponent cannot bet anymore on that specific street. So you just realize your equity and see a next card. That is not the case when you're out of position. So what you want to do here is you want to protect the checking range and implement some strong hands into there. So your opponent is not capable of relentlessly firing in position because he now knows that your range is protected. You will check raise aggressively, or at least with a reasonable frequency, and therefore he will shut down at least a little bit, at least that's what he should do, in order for not being check raised all the time. So those are some takeaways, what you need to think about whenever you're out of position. Whenever the board is dynamic, like here, frequencies are pretty low. Obviously on A-side board textures, betting frequencies are much higher. Broadway board textures, betting frequencies are extremely low because they connect very strongly to the in-position cold caller. And like these medium and low boards, they are anywhere between like a betting frequency of like 10 and 20%. If you want to learn more about out of position betting, c-betting, and specifically right now we launch a new course in the PLO Mastermind, Single Race Pot Out of Position Strategy, hosted by Fernando, aka JNanders87, where we dive extremely deep into out of position c-bet strategy. Link is below in the episode if you want to read more about it. Okay, so those are some general takeaways here. As mentioned, we were holding ace king 10-9 with the backdoor flush draw, but no heart. This is definitely a medium strong hand, even at the bottom of our medium strong hand. So a hand like ace king 10-9. When we consider all the factors, being out of position, being a very dynamic board texture where we are seeing a lot of texture shift, you can already imagine that a hand here that doesn't have like a flush draw, for example, is very infrequently going to be a bet, because you will put yourself in a very tough spot on turns. Imagine you bet a lot of these hands, turns are changing the textures, your hand is not strong enough to bet, you check, your opponent stabs, and you just end up check folding a lot on turns. So ace king 10-9 here, as you can see, if we do have spades, there's a mix between betting, some of them, or checking, and if we check, there is a reasonable amount of check raising because we are so nutted with mainly the nut flush draw or the backdoor flush draw in addition. But our hand, ace king 10-9, without any spade, basically, it's just a pure check here, basically because we lack equity, we lack strong blockers, and we lack good runouts here. This hand is also extremely low expected value, basically EV, in other words here. If you look at a hand like this, and you think about the equity of this hand, you can see that the equity of this specific hand versus our opponent's range is hovering around 42%. But if you look at how much equity we're actually going to realize, in other words, what is the EV of this hand in this specific situation, based on the milli small blinds shown here, and based on what is in the pot, 17 equals to 17,000 milli small blinds. You can see here the numbers. You can see that these are hovering between like 2,000 and 3,500. So it's max around 20% of the pot that we're really capturing here. So we're under realizing our equity extremely with a hand like this. We're just checking in the hope our opponent checks back, that we sometimes realize our equity. If we check and our opponent takes a step, we're actually just going to check fold this specific combo. Realizability of equity is just too problematic. We will get in a lot of problems on turns and rivers. We're out of position in high SPR, and on these dynamic textures, be extremely selective. So Hero here did decide to go for the bet. Again, this is a mistake in this situation. We're playing against a strong cold calling range. If you'd be sitting cutoff versus button, for example, so wider cold calling ranges in position, check calling a hand like this is okay, but against a tighter cold calling range in general, you want to be selective and just check fold a hand like this. Okay, guys, that's gonna be it. We are in now for 19 minutes already. Hope you enjoyed this one. It's a little bit of a deeper analysis, but sometimes we are going for that, and I hope that you get some takeaways from this. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this episode, and make sure to let me know in the comment section what you think of this video. Take care, guys. Hope to see you soon. Bye-bye. Good luck at the table.